Well, our text is going to be taken from Luke 12, as you can see, verses 22 to 34 that Brian read. I'd like to back up a little bit. Look at that story just before. Verses 13 to 21, the parable of the rich fool. I'd like to read that to kind of set the context of what's going on, because the context in which something is said is part of what it means. So this is going to help us understand verses 22 to 34. Look at verse 13. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." I hate to stop there after just one verse, but this verse really burns me up. Jesus is on the road to Jerusalem. He's got crowds of people that are following him, and one man talks to Jesus and wants Jesus to do something for him. Could you imagine having maybe one shot? Maybe you could ask Jesus one thing. Maybe you could tell Jesus one thing. And what you said was this: tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. Are they on a playground? He took my ball. Tell him to give it back to me. Like, what does he expect him to say? Jesus, he doesn't give free legal counsel to this man. He says in verse 14, "Man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over you?" But he does use this man's statement as a springboard for some teaching about the danger of wealth, doesn't he? You can see it, verse 15. He said to them, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness. For one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." And he told them a parable, saying, "The land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, 'What shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops.' And he said, 'I'll do this. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat and drink and be merry.' But God said to him, 'Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things that you've prepared, whose will they be?' And Jesus says, 'So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God.'" So, Jesus tells the story about the danger of greed, and he tells this parable of the rich fool. And we know that he's foolish, not just because God calls him a fool, but we know he's foolish by the way he's talking to himself, right? Listen to the kind of things that he says. He had a false estimate, first of all, of time. He thought he had many years to relax and enjoy his wealth, but God said to him, "This night your soul is required of you." He had a false estimate of purpose. He gets this windfall from a bumper crop, and what does he do? Does he turn to the Word of God and say, "What would God have me to do with this wealth?" No, he opens his business manual and he says, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to control the market share. I'm going to inflate the prices of grain, and I'm going to live off the proceeds. And he thinks life then is all about getting ahead and taking it easy. There's no words of gratitude. There's no words of duty or generosity, no actions of generosity, because he wasn't rich in the one way that really mattered. He wasn't rich toward God. He had only laid up treasure for who? For himself. He also had a false estimate of control. He said to himself, "Self, you have ample goods." But God says, in the end, you don't have anything. He said, "All the things that you've prepared, whose will they be? Because they won't be yours because you're dead." And then he has a false estimate of value. He thought his possessions were ample. He saw the value of his material wealth, but he hadn't reckoned on the value of his own soul. And Jesus said, even before this, back in chapter 9, in verse 25, "What does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses or forfeits his soul?" We say, wow, that's a powerful, convicting text, isn't it? I don't think it is a lot of the time, actually, if I'm honest with myself. I think the power of this text is sometimes lost on us because we don't immediately identify with this rich guy. We don't think of ourselves as wealthy because we're surrounded by people that we see are wealthier than us. And so we read this text from a comfortable distance, and we kind of have a little smugness about it. Well, that rich man, look at that filthy materialist. He got what he deserved, right? And any impact that the parable might have had on us just kind of passes us by. But it's awfully foolish to dismiss the fool. You ever have a teacher, maybe like a high school teacher, who they would zero in on one student? Not to pick on anybody, but Jackson, we're going to pick on you. And they'd be explaining this concept. Maybe it was your English class, your American literature class, and you just had read To Kill a Mockingbird, and now Jackson's heartbeat is starting to go, and the teacher is explaining, in chapter 3, when Atticus sits down with Jim, and he's having this discussion, and goes on, and he's just locking eyes with Jackson the whole time, and he says, Grant Smith, what do you think about that? You ever have a teacher like that? Or maybe your dad was like that? This is kind of what Jesus is doing with this parable. He's talking about this rich fool, and we're sitting back and we're kind of lulled into this false sense of security, and we're kind of laughing at the fool because we don't automatically identify him. But then Jesus, we find out the whole time, he's really talking to us, isn't he? Notice Jesus in verse 22, he turns to his disciples and says, therefore. Verse 21, he says, don't be like this rich man. And then he goes and he develops this teaching about covetousness, but he relates it to anxiety instead. Now, most of the followers of Jesus weren't particularly wealthy people, and yet Jesus warns them, don't be like that rich man. When he says, therefore, in verse 22, he's saying the story of the rich fool has relevance for you, my disciples. Even though you might not be in that same financial position where you can build bigger barns for your grain. Now, the keynote of this whole passage is verse 15, and it's worth reading a second time. Take care. Be on your guard against all covetousness. When Jesus says all covetousness, what does that suggest to us? Greed can take various forms, right? If there's all covetousness, greed can take various forms. The rich fool's covetousness has to do with his greed over what he has, what he possesses. But our covetousness often has to do with anxiety over what we don't have or what we think we don't have. Verses 22 to 34. So greed has less to do with how much we possess, and it has more to do with how we think about our wealth, our mentality. And a certain fixation on our career and our financial and our physical needs, that's proof that we really think that life does consist in the abundance of possessions. And when we become anxious about making a living, as the saying goes, we're really showing the same kind of covetous spirit as the rich fool. So in our text, the text that Brian read, verses 22 to 34, the Lord teaches us how to overcome greed and all the anxiety that comes from greed. And we're going to break up the text into 3 basic points. And they're all very simple. The first one is that we need to correct our thinking. If you're worried about financial things, if you're worried about making ends meet, you need to correct your thinking. The command to be anxious in verse 22, therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat, nor about your body, what you will put on. That command is followed by an explanation. You see the word for in verse 23. For, or don't be anxious, because, and he launches into several arguments here. When we're anxious about making a living, the Lord, what does he want us to do? He wants us to think. He wants us to think rationally to overcome that anxiety, because anxiety is an emotion. It's an emotional response to pressure. So the antidote is to be rational. So he makes these several logical arguments that, hey, you might not get everything that you want, but you're going to get what you need. Look at what he says. He makes an argument from provision in verse 23. For life is more than food, and the body is more than clothing. This is a logical argument from the greater to the lesser. Can you see that? If God provides us with life, then surely he's going to provide us with the lesser gift of food to sustain that life. Jesus said when he was tempted by the devil, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. He wasn't denying that we do need bread, don't we? We just don't need bread only. We do need bread, and God is going to give us that bread to sustain our life. And if God provides us with a body, then surely he's going to provide us with the lesser gift of clothing to sustain that body. Does that make sense to us? It makes sense. But we're not thinking that way when we're anxious. So it's an argument from provision. He makes another argument here from value. Look at verse 24, and then again verses 27 and 28. Consider the ravens. They neither sow nor reap. They have neither storehouse nor barn, and yet God feeds them. Of how much more value are you than birds? He makes the same kind of argument in verses 27 and 28. Consider the lilies, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin, and yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass, which is alive in the field today and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, how much more will he clothe you, O you of little faith? So verse 23 was an argument from the greater to the lesser. But here he's making the argument the other way around. He's making an argument from the lesser to the greater. He says, consider the ravens, consider the lilies. Again, consider. What does that word mean? It means to think about, to stop and pause, to ponder, to use your brain, to be rational. If God takes care of these ravens, which, by the way, are unclean animals according to the law of Moses, and they don't have health care plans, and they don't have mortgages, and they don't have 401ks, and if he cares for the lilies, which are burned up in a season, but they actually make Solomon in all his glory look drab by comparison, well, then can't he be trusted to care for you and give you what you need? So the next time you're driving down the highway and you see a pack of crows or scavenger birds picking at a flattened raccoon carcass on the side of the road, you might stop and consider that. And you might say, wow, great is thy faithfulness, O God my Father. Morning by morning, your mercies I see. When you see the wildflowers in April this year and their fleeting splendor across the landscape, you might sing to yourself, this is my Father's world. And the birds their carols raise, the morning bright, the lily white, declare their Maker's praise. Why should my heart be sad? The Lord is King. Let heaven ring. God reigns. Let earth be glad. We're worth a lot more to God than unclean birds and seasonal flowers. Again, we don't think about that when we're anxious about money, but we need to, Jesus is saying. A third argument he makes is one from utility in verses 25 and 26. That is, what works, what is of use. What does he say in verse 25? Which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to his span of life? If then you're not able to do as small a thing as that, why are you anxious about the rest? So anxiety can't add anything to our life except for more grief. It can't add any time to our life. In fact, doctors say it can shorten our lifespan. So it doesn't have any utility. It doesn't enhance our existence or benefit us whatsoever. Make sense? Makes sense. So why do we do it? We do it. Doesn't do anything, but we do it. It can't solve tomorrow's problems. We're always worried about the future. What's coming next? Worry can't solve tomorrow's problems. It just compounds today's problems. And it eats up all of our spiritual and emotional resources that we need today. So the strength that God gives you for today is meant to be used on the problems that you face today, not on what's coming down the pipeline. Just focus on today. He makes a final argument here about an argument from priority. Priority, in verse 29 to 31. And do not seek what you are to eat and what you are to drink, nor be worried, for all the nations of the world seek after these things. Your Father knows you need them. Instead, he says, seek his kingdom, and all these things will be added to you. So when we're anxious, who are we acting like? We're acting like the pagans. We're acting like unbelievers, the nations. Because they don't know God's love. They don't know God's provision for them. All their attention is absorbed in acquiring and retaining wealth and getting ahead and climbing that ladder. That's all that they care about. And they fret over it all the time, and they wear themselves out with anxiety because it's never enough, even when they achieve that next rung on the ladder. But when we seek God's kingdom, that is, when we prioritize serving God, loving God, worshiping God, obeying God, when that is our priority, we find that our needs are met. These things, the necessities of life, will be added to you. Again, not everything that you want, but certainly everything that you need. God knows that we all need life's essentials, and He's going to provide those things for us. But by prioritizing the things that really matter, that alleviates our worry over material things. Now, that may sound kind of counterintuitive. You think that to reduce stress about a thing, you need to focus more on it and not less. And yet Jesus says, no. If you want to reduce stress about material things, you got to think about spiritual things, actually. You got to have the right foundation in your life. You know, in science, a correct premise is crucial to your deductions in your scientific findings. So when early scientists assumed that the Earth was the center of the universe, that geocentric model of the universe, well, guess what? All of their astronomical calculations were off. But once the heliocentric model with the sun at the center was adopted, suddenly their calculations began to fall in line, and they can predict the orbits of the planetary bodies and so on. Well, the same is true here. If we put God at the center of everything that we do, the secondary details will work themselves out. So what's Jesus' point? It's very clear, isn't it? God is worthy of our ultimate trust. He provides us with life. He provides us with a body. Therefore, we can trust Him that He will provide us with the lesser things that life and body needs, food and clothing. He provides for the lesser creatures and the plants. Therefore, we can trust Him that He's going to provide for us who are made in His image. So overcoming anxiety and finding peace about these things, well, it might require us to correct our thinking. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, again, very simple. Remember who you are. Remember your identity. Once we correct our thinking about God, we need to know who we are in relation to God. And Jesus gives us several pictures of the Christian's identity that should relieve our stress, should relieve our fears about the physical things. So who are we? Well, look at verse 30. He says, "For all the nations of the world seek after these things, and your Father knows that you need Him." If God is our Father, then who are we? Well, we're the Father's children, aren't we? And it's the Father's responsibility to care for His children. God is the best Father. He's not neglectful. He's not annoyed. He's not temperamental. When we ask Him for things, He knows what the children need before they ask Him. He always gives good gifts to His children. He listens to us. So why would we fear when we've got a Father like that? Or look at verse 31. Verse 31, he says, instead seek His kingdom. Well, a kingdom requires a king. And if God is our king, then who are we in relation to the king? Well, we're the subjects of the king. And it's the king's responsibility to defend and provide for the welfare of his subjects. And what a king we have in Jesus, ruling over us. Right? He rules in the most just and fair way, just like Brian reminded us from Psalm 72 on Wednesday. He's the kind of king that we can really put our faith in. And look at Jesus. Look how much He loves His subjects, that He died for us. What a king we've got that loves us so much. You got this king. He's the king of the universe. He upholds the whole universe by the word of His power, and yet He knows the minutia of our life. He can count every hair on our heads. That's a great king we have. And then in verse 32, he says, "Fear not, little flock." Well, if we're the flock, then that means He's our shepherd. And it's the shepherd's responsibility to protect his sheep. And Christ is the good shepherd. He lays down His life for the sheep, so on and so forth. He guides us to green pastures. As Josh pointed out from Psalm 23, He makes us lie down beside the still waters. If the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. I'll not want for anything. He's going to provide for everything that I need. And we believe that on Sunday mornings, don't we? It's the rest of the time when we struggle. If we remember who we are, we're not going to be overwhelmed with anxiety. You sometimes the birds do better at this than we do. Maybe you've heard that little snatch of poetry. Said the robin to the sparrow, I should really like to know why these anxious human beings rush about and worry so. Said the sparrow to the robin, friend, I think that it must be that they have no heavenly Father, such as cares for you and me. When we're constantly worrying about the future, it's like we've forgotten who our God is and what he thinks of us and who we are in relation to him. I know I talk about Scout a lot, right? But look at Scout, right? So when we first got Scout, it was 2 years ago, roughly. And Scout was on her own for who knows how long, covered in ticks, living out in the wilds of West Virginia. And we were just so delighted to have her. We would give her treats. We would give her bones. You know what that dog did with all those treats? She'd go and she'd bury those treats. She'd take the bone and we would find like treats stuffed between the cushions of the couch. We'd find them. It was during Christmas when we got her. They were like in our Christmas tree. She'd be digging holes in the ground and putting them there. And we're like, why isn't this dog eating these treats? And so as time wore on and she kind of became acclimated to this, well, she started to eat the treats. We'd give her one and then she learned to kind of sit down, just wag her tail in gratitude, and she'd enjoy it. Well, what happened? Well, I don't really know. This is just my opinion. But I think she was afraid that, when she was living on her own, she probably didn't know when her next meal was going to come, and so she was storing it for the future. She was hoarding it up. But once she realized she was part of the family, and once she realized that she could trust us to provide for her, well, then she just started enjoying things as they came. I learn a lot from Scout, right? And I think that's biblical. Jesus tells us to consider the lilies, consider the ravens. He probably tells us to consider the dogs as well. So, who are we? Have we learned that lesson is the point. Who are we? We're the children of a generous Father. We're the subjects of a sacrificial King. And we're the sheep of a caring shepherd. Surely, goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Now, there's one final point. Exercise your freedom. Verses 33 and 34. Jesus says, sell your possessions and give to the needy. Provide yourself with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. So if we are able to take Jesus' teaching and correct our thinking and remember who we are, then we can actually begin to exercise our freedom. When we're free from the slavery of greed and hoarding our resources, all the anxiety that comes with that greed, well, then we can sell our possessions, we can give to the poor. We're no longer fixated on acquiring wealth for ourselves. And when that happens, we're free to be generous. And it's interesting here that he stresses the giving of capital and not just the giving of income. Now, Paul stresses the giving of income, I think, in places like 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. You take what you earn, you set a little bit aside, and so on. This is a little bit different. He's actually telling us to take some of what we already possess and go and sell it, downsize, simplify your life, because you don't need all that garbage anyway. Take the proceeds and give it to someone who actually does need it. Now, there's not a one of us, I dare say, who this doesn't apply to. We all have too much, right? We all could do this. I don't know what that looks like for you, going on eBay, having a garage sale. Maybe it's as simple as reducing your expenses a little bit. You know how this is a subscription era, and we tack on these little subscriptions, $5 here, $10 here a month, and we end up not really using all these things. Sell it and give it. You're free to do that if you know who you are and if you're thinking clearly. And then he stresses giving here as an investment in the latter part of verse 33. We understand the concept of saving for retirement, right? We're always being told you make this short-term sacrifice now while you're young and you have your working years, your career is going, to meet these long-term goals. And the more you put away, we're constantly told, the better off you're going to be in the future. And we understand that. Yeah, unless the stock market tanks, which could happen, unless the economy takes a nosedive, or unless it gets stolen, or unless the person that is investing your funds is dishonest. It's been known to happen. You're going to put all your trust in that? There's no guarantee you're going to get a return on that investment. And hey, let's say you crush. Let's say you turn 60 and you start drawing on this stuff. Well, you're only going to get to enjoy it for however much time you have left. And how much time is that? Do you know? And whose will these things be? But when we serve God, when we prioritize His kingdom in verse 31, and we start giving to others, these are the kind of investments that are incorruptible, that are eternal, that are secure in the heavens. Don't you know that it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom? He wants to give you the kingdom? If that's our inheritance, well, doesn't that loosen our grip a little bit on the temporary, fleeting wealth that we have in this world? Now, there's nothing wrong with working hard, nothing wrong with taking out an insurance policy or saving up and saving for retirement and all of that, and investing. Nothing wrong with that. Jesus is not warning us about that. He's warning us about being anxious about such things. Do we see that? About being anxious about such things and about seeking those things as our first priority. You know, the word anxious is the same word that was used to describe Martha. Martha was distracted about many things. Do you remember Martha in chapter 10? And what did she miss out on? Her anxiety about these necessary things, important things, but secondary things. Well, that kept her from the good part. The word anxious is the same word that is used about the good seed that was sown among the thorns, and it was choked by the anxieties or the cares of this life. It's a fixation, it's a distraction, it's a preoccupation that robs other areas, more important areas. Have you ever seen someone fixated? I mean, really preoccupied, really distracted. I'm like this when I'm working. See, with the building all torn up, that means I've got to work from home. And any of you guys who have been in our home know that there's zero privacy. So I have a desk that's kind of in the middle of our foyer. And it's wonderful. It's nice and light and airy. But there are some distractions. So I kind of focus. I try to focus as much as I can. And I'm working on a problem or something. And Rachel may come in at some point and may tell me something. Like, hey, I couldn't get that salad dressing stain out of your khaki pants, and I just wanted to let you know I'm going to scrub them again and run them through the wash. Just want you to know so that you won't ask later. And I will give all of the clues that I heard her. And you know where this is going. It's 6:57 on Wednesday night when we're trying to get to church for the Bible study. I'm going to say, hey, Rachel, where are those khaki pants at? Right? I'm fixated, right? That's how we can be when we're seeking first the things of this world, when we're so focused and anxious about money, about financial concerns. It's not just rich fools who are ruled by it. Anxiety over money can enslave anyone, and it can make us tight-fisted. But when we correct our thinking, remember who we are, we can finally risk being generous. We risk it on the fidelity of our God. That's freedom, brothers and sisters. We need that kind of freedom. It's good for us. Paul gives it to, as Paul often does, he gives it to us in a nutshell when he talks about the converted thief in Ephesians 4. Here's the passage. Let the thief no longer steal, but rather let him labor, doing honest work with his own hands, so that he may have something to share with anyone in need. Well, what have you got there? Well, you've got honesty first. The Christian repents of his sins. He gives up lying, he gives up stealing, and he aims to live an honest life. But that's not it. He doesn't just give up the bad things. He starts making positive practices. That honesty leads to industry. The Christian works. He labors with his hands to provide for himself and his family. All this talk about, Jesus' talk about, trusting in God's provision, that doesn't mean that we're exempt from working. Think about the example that he used. Ravens, they neither sow nor reap. That's true, but that doesn't mean that ravens are lazy. No, God provides what they need in nature, and the ravens have to go and get it, right? He's not just miraculously, dropping manna from heaven for them. In the same way with us, God provides for us, we still have to work. So the Christian works. But not only that, but he's generous. The Christian gives. He works not just for himself so that he can, but so also he can share with other people in need. So he's set free, first of all, from the sins of theft and idleness. That's great. But he's also set free from the sins of selfishness and greed. And he works hard and he trusts that God will not only give him what he needs, but will provide such an abundance that he can have something extra when someone else needs it. So let's conclude here. Verse 34, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Our heart is going to follow our treasure wherever it goes, up to heaven or down to earth. So let's end here with a couple of practical points. How can we seek God's kingdom? How can we be rich towards God? How can we lay up treasures in the heavens? We need to correct our thinking about God's provision, remember our identity as God's children. We need to exercise our freedom by living generously. But here's a couple of takeaways for you. First of all, we are stewards, not owners of our wealth, managing the gift of wealth. We are stewards, not owners, managing the gift of wealth. If we're not careful, the things that we own become so dear to us that they actually start to own us. But if we realize that everything we have actually belongs to God, it was given to us by God, and we're just stewards of it for a little while, it helps us to think differently about our wealth. And we can be a little bit more free with it and more generous with it. If it belongs to God, then we have to use it in God-honoring ways, don't we? So second of all, we're givers and not hoarders, sharing the support of wealth. You know, every time we give as a Christian, what we're doing is we're slowly breaking the grip of materialism on our life. And our fists begin to unclench when we realize that generosity is really not a loss to us. When we're thinking like a Christian, it's a gain. It's an investment in our eternal future, storing up treasure in heaven that doesn't fail, and it's making us better people. You know, I've given a few lessons, and I'm not saying this, believe me, I'm not saying this to pat myself on the back or anything like that. You guys, I hope, understand. I don't often preach about giving and that kind of thing, but as I always say, I have to deal with this text all week, and then it finally comes out on Sunday. Well, every time I preach on giving, me and Rachel increase our contribution, because you're forced with this kind of thing, and you just got to say, you know what? I don't need that, and I can give a little bit more. You know, that's what God's word, should do for us. So we are givers and not hoarders, sharing the support of our wealth, and I hope that convicts you in the same way. Not just giving to the church, but giving to Christians in need and giving in whatever way that you can. And number 3, we're believers, not worriers, enjoying the blessing of wealth. We believe in God's provision. Therefore, we can be content with what we have. We can enjoy it as God intended. We don't ask, do I have enough? Because enough always ends up being a little bit more than what we possess right now. Rather, we ask, am I rich toward God? And answering that question and wrestling with that, that's going to lead us down a better path. So let's end with this passage. In the context of giving, this is what Paul says to the Corinthians. You know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet became poor, so that you by his poverty might become rich. And I hope that you know that about your Lord Jesus. At the very least today, I hope you know that Jesus left heaven, the glories, the perfection of in the presence of his Father, to come down to this earth and to live a hard life and to ultimately sacrifice himself because he loves you. He loves me and he loves you. And he gave himself. He became poor so that we could become rich. Rich in what way? Rich in him, right? Rich with his grace. Rich with his love. If you need to respond to the gospel, then we invite you to do that right now as we stand up and as we sing.